Hello and welcome to the OKPreps Extra Show. I'm Patrick Prince, joined by Barry Lewis. Well, Barry, week five's in the books. Owasso continued to be dominant. Jinx looked a little bit like Jinx again. Booker T. Washington has entered your 5A rankings for the first time this year. Where do you want to start? When you look back, what's the biggest takeaway from week five?
I think the biggest takeaway was Owasso's total domination of Union. It wasn't surprising that Owasso beat Union, but the way they did it was what was really impressive. I mean, from start to finish, it was a totally dominating performance. I thought Union had a shot at winning. But wow, was I wrong? Uh, Owasso just continues to dominate in all three phases of the game. And they look pretty unstoppable right now.
Are they going to finish the regular season undefeated?
I would say so. I think their toughest competition, and they've played the toughest teams already. Their toughest competition is behind them. And now it's just a matter of trying to stay sharp the rest of the way. You don't want to peak too early. That's the only thing, that's the only danger for them, along with, yes, you want to avoid injuries, but right now they look pretty unstoppable, with the possible exception of Bixby. It might be interesting if Bixby faces them again, but wow, what an impressive performance. What an impressive first half of the regular season it has been for the Owasso-Rams. So all credit to new head coach Antonio Graham and his staff and all the players.
If there's anything that can trip up Owasso, it's what?
Besides injuries, it would just be
Besides that,
just lack of focus. Right now, I mean, they've got the formula you need for winning football games, not just in September and October, but in November and December. The running game is really, really good. Got the best offensive line in the state. Defense is coming on, getting better and better. Special teams are solid. It's a really unique team for 6A1. The fact that they remind me of the Miami Dolphins from the Don Shula days in the 1970s, when they had such a great ground game with Larry Zonka and Jim Kick and Mercury Morris. And Bob Greasy is one of the best quarterbacks around. He didn't have to throw it very much. I mean, it was not uncommon for him to just throw the ball 10 times or less in a game because he didn't have to throw it anymore. And that's the way it is with Drew Frankenfield. He only threw the ball once in the second half last week, and that was a touchdown to his offensive tackle, Blake Cherry. They don't have to pass very much, but when they do, they're really, really good. So they're just clicking in all ways.
your top game this week, Barry, is number 5 Jinx at number 9 Mustang. Jinx kind of returned to form a little bit last week versus Norman. What do you expect out of the Trojans this week?
Think more of the same. I mean, it'll be a challenge going over to Mustang, which is 4-1, and it's their missed field goal from being 5-0. But just like with Norman, which came in last week 4-0, even though on paper it looks like Norman and Mustang might be favored, I think in reality, Jenks is probably the favored team in this game, even though Jenks is only 2-3. Jenks has played the top competition, and I think that bodes well for Jenks. That's why so many times you see Jenks really turn it on late in the year, even though they don't have like a really glossy record. But when November and December comes around, they're in the Final Four or in the state championship game, because those early lessons, tough competition really helps them out down the stretch. This Jenks Mustang game is interesting in the fact that it's Jenks' first time there since their stunning 2022 quarterfinal win, when Jenks was down 19 in the fourth quarter at Mustang, and Jenks winds up winning. So, Mustang remembers that. Jenks remembers that. So that adds to the story. That's another interesting storyline for this game. But last week, I think we saw with the Jenks offense, for the first time, what it really could be. On the opening game of the season, the Jenks offense was really good, but they didn't have Caleb Barnett in that game. last week, Caleb Barnett was really a part of the game plan for the first time this season. And remember, Caleb was the number one receiver in our all-world rankings in the preseason. And last week was the first time he was really a part of the game plan, and he caught 3 big passes, 2 for touchdowns, and he just adds another dimension to the Jenks offense, which already has a lot of potential because they have arguably one of the state's best running backs with KD Jones.
Barry, am I remembering this wrong? Didn't a 3 or 4 loss Jinx team recently get to the 6A title game? Am I remembering that wrong?
That's correct. And I remember all season long, including leading up to the championship game, I get people asking me, "What's wrong with Jenks? What's wrong with Jenks?" And finally, I hear that question the last week of the season when they're about to play in the state championship game. And I said, "Nothing's wrong with Jenks. They're in the state championship game."
What year was that?
It was fairly recently.
Right. Yeah, I mean that, and you're really good about this, Barry. When a lot of people are overreacting, you're usually the voice of reason on a lot of things. And you've been pointing that out, that yeah, Jinx maybe hasn't been looking like Jinx, but they look who they've been playing. And so last week at Norman, they looked, I say at Norman, that game was in Jinx, right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
in this week's game, obviously, is not going to be easy at Mustang. As I said, Mustang is close to being 5-0. They've got a really good quarterback, Trajan Williamson, and but I think Jenks is Jenks, and that Jenks will find a way to win.
Yeah. Barry, we haven't talked a whole lot about Muskogee so far this season. They host Bartlesville this week. It's the first time pj-Wallace will be playing his former team, former Bartlesville, current Muskogee running back. What do you see out of that game?
Isn't this a really unique game too? Because I mean, it's not uncommon these days for players to be going against their former teammates in the era of a lot of transfers occurring, and you had all those former Jenks players playing at Union, playing against Jenks in the Backyard Bowl, and having had it, many of those players having won a state title at Jenks. So that was a unique situation too. But here you have pj-Wallace, who is Bartlesville's career rushing leader, going against the Bruins. I think that is really interesting. And weirdly enough, Bartlesville hasn't won a game without him. The last time Bartlesville won a game, pj-Wallace was their leading rusher. Bartlesville lost a really tough one last week against Sapulpa in overtime. So Bartlesville's close to being pretty decent. They're winless, but they'll probably remain winless after this week against Muskogee. I think just Muskogee's way too much for them, but it's just a really interesting matchup. pj-Wallace, who's one of Bartlesville's all-time great players, going against his former team.
Has Muskogee been what you thought they would be this year, coming off the state title, having one of the state's best quarterbacks?
For the most part, pretty much. And although there were a couple games that were closer than I thought they might be early in the season, they had a couple of narrow escapes, but in the end, they're pretty well what I thought they would be. pj-Wallace will be well rested for this game Friday, because he only had to carry the ball twice in last week's route, as was expected at Putnam West.
Booker T. Washington has entered your 5A rankings this week, Barry, at number 10. They are 3-2 heading into this week's game versus Bishop-Kelley. What do you make of Booker T. and Dan Bitson's first year?
Booker T. looks much improved over last year's team. Dan Bitson doing a really good job. Obviously, they got off to a bit of a slow start, but it's only because of the competition they played, primarily Muskogee and Del City. But since then, they've won 3 in a row. They're back on track. And I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism over at Booker T. And this week they play Bishop-Kelley, which also played a tough non-district schedule. They've won their last 2 games. So both teams are 2-0 in the district. And the winner of this game will have a clear shot at McAllister for the district title.
More than anything, what has Coach Bitson done that has led to their success so far?
Just sometimes you can have the talent, and sometimes it's just a new voice, a new approach. And obviously, Dan Bitson has a lot of experience, has had success as a head coach, has been at the college level. Just a little of a new attitude there. I think he's just instilled a new attitude at Booker T. And the mental part of the game is so important. And I think it's just they need to turn the page at Booker T. It was time to turn the page at Booker T and have someone else try it. And Dan Bitson has really, I think, brought some optimism there. And he's just a really good football coach, head coach.
Barry, Wagner is the number one team, your number one team in 4A. They're 5-0. They've blown through their schedule so far. They had a kind of for them, an average first half last week on the offensive end and end up winning 55-13. Is this going to be their closest game of the season this week when they play 3-2 Catoosa? I'm sorry. Yeah, 3-2. They're 3-2.
It might be, but then again, it could be the following week against Cushing, or it could be against Grove. I think that's a really good district. But right now, Wagner looks pretty much like a juggernaut. It's sort of like what Owasso's been in 6A1, although we were expecting this of Wagner. Wagner has looked so much better in the first 5 weeks of this season than it did last year coming off the state championship. Even though Wagner also was 5-0 at this point last year, it wasn't like really an impressive 5-0, if you could say such a thing. But this year, you can tell they're on a mission. They don't want to have a letdown. They don't want to let that goal ball slip away like it did last year. And it's really apparent. And Catoosa, it looks like Catoosa's got its best team since 2018. And so I think a good night for Catoosa would be if they could somehow keep it under the 15 district points.
Mm-hmm.
I think whenever you play Wagner, I think you would consider that a good night if you're a district opponent. I think you'd pick up district points on the rest of the field if you can keep the margin under 15. Of course, all those teams, Catoosa's going in this game thinking that it can win, and why not? They played number 5 Grove, a 1-point game a couple weeks ago. Catoosa's playing really well, so not any pressure on them. They just need to go out, keep doing what they've been doing, and it'll be interesting to see how well they can compete with Wagner, because Catoosa hasn't really competed that well with Wagner in recent years. But this will be a good measuring stick to see how far Catoosa has come along.
Who should be on upset watch this week?
I would say Grove. It goes to Fort Gibson. Fort Gibson has been ranked, not ranked right now, because it's really tough to get into the 4A rankings. Grove 5-0. They played some close games. Fort Gibson 4-1. Fort Gibson won a thriller last week. They've played some close games. That's going to be a tough one for Grove. And Claremore at Pryor. Claremore 5-0, ranked 5th. Last year, Pryor gave them about as tough a game as anyone in the regular season, except for Bishop-Kelley, who beat Claremore in the regular season last year. But Claremore barely escaped with a 1-point win over Pryor last year. And you remember how great Claremore was last season. So Pryor's playing really well. They're coming off a 1-point loss, or else they would be 4-1 instead of 3-2. So it might be a tricky game for Claremore.
Barry, we talk a lot about rankings on this show because they're your rankings. You're the one who does them. Can you just give a little insight to how you do these rankings? Because this isn't college. Not every game is on TV where you can just pop up the highlights and kind of get all the information you want. I would imagine this is a little bit of a process for you every week. Can you just kind of explain that a little bit?
It is a bit of a process every week. It's even more so this year with 3 more classifications to do. In 2A, with 2A, A, and B being split up. And so that's complicated things a bit. But yeah, it's usually just doing as much homework as possible, talking to people who they think is good, and just looking at schedules. I think what makes our rankings a little bit different than some other rankings is I look at the team's schedules more, and not just the one-loss record, but I try to take into consideration who teams have been playing more so than what the record. Yes, the record is important, absolutely. But I think I'm more patient when a team like a Jenks starts off 1-3, and it's played such a blockbuster schedule. Then I'm not automatically going to put a team that's 4-0 over a team that's 1-3.
Do you ever call maybe a coach who has played two teams that you're not sure maybe to rank one ahead of the other? Do you ever call a coach and be like, hey, I've got so-and-so at 3 and so-and-so at 4. Is that the right order, or should I reverse them? Like, you know what I mean? Like, do you ever kind of call coaches and seek their input on not only their team, but other teams?
Not specifically like that. Like, I would not necessarily say who should be ranked 4 or 5, but I might just ask them, well, what do you think about so-and-so? Are they legit? They're 5-0, but it doesn't look like they played anybody really tough. Might go at it from that approach.
Give us a little reminder on the photo day coming up.
Tulsa World Winter Sports Photo Day is Tuesday, October 29th at Union High School's UMAC, the Red Zone Room. It's a drop-in from any time from 3:30 to 6:30 p.m. Coaches are invited to bring their top 5 to 7 or 8 student athletes from basketball, swimming, and wrestling. But also, if those are the teams that we've mainly are focusing on, the emphasis is on inviting, but any football team that did not make it to football photo day back in August is invited to come as well. And also any spring sports teams, spring sports student athletes who want to come, they are invited as well too. You readers might have noticed that we're starting to do these get to know the student athlete profiles. Basically fun facts about student athletes. You have 5 or 6 fun facts about student athletes, and along with their picture in capsules in both print and online. And those 98% of those come from photo day. So in order to have one of those get to know featureized capsules, you need to come to photo day.
So Barry, before we get out of here, I always love picking your brain about baseball because you're such a great mind on all things sports, but there's something about talking baseball with you that I find particularly fun. Why don't you share with us your Pete Rose story, who died? I want to talk about Pete Rose during last week's show and kind of forgot about it. He died last week. You've got kind of an interesting story about Pete Rose. Why don't you share that?
Well, my favorite Pete Rose memory, and I got to see him play quite a few times, thankfully, in person, but my favorite memory doesn't directly involve him. He is somewhat related to this story, though, because it's March of 1989, late March 1989 during spring training, and the high school basketball season is over. And as was my tradition back then, I'd go to Arizona for a week and stay with my parents there, just to relax, vacation, and see some baseball and play some golf. But anyway, my parents were taking me out for dinner one night, this really nice restaurant. And it's a day or two after the commissioner's office of baseball had announced that Pete Rose was under investigation for gambling. And that had really shook up the baseball world. That was the big news, not just in sports, but overall, it was on overall newscasts. And so we're having dinner, and who should be seated in a table next to us? It's the new commissioner of baseball, Bart Giamatti, like, of all people. Wow. And he's got one of his colleagues with him. And of course, I'm sure they were trying to get away a little break, but they were, the Pete Rose subject was being talked about. And it was one of these weird situations for me where didn't want to be obvious, but I wasn't really probably very social with my parents that night because I'm trying to overhear the conversation that Bart Giamatti is having with this Pete Rose situation going on. And so a very interesting night. I could tell that Bart Giamatti was known for, besides loving baseball, he loved food and he loved to smoke, and that was all evident that night. And of course, about 6 months later, Bart Giamatti winds up giving Pete Rose what has turned out to be a permanent suspension from baseball, although it wasn't meant to be at the time necessarily. And then a week after that suspension was handed out, Bart Giamatti died of a heart attack at a way too young age. I think he's 51. But
Oh, wow.
anyway, that was quite an interesting night in Scottsdale, Phoenix.
If you had a vote, would you vote Pete Rose into the Hall of Fame?
I was not a Pete Rose fan per se, although I really respected in many ways how he approached the game. I would vote for him. I think he should at least be eligible to be voted on because he is Major League Baseball's hits leader. He was such a big part of the game. I'm not a big fan of his because he had a lot of problems. More than the gambling. He had a 30-day suspension the previous year that Bart Giamatti gave him for pushing an umpire. Then he had spent some time in prison for tax problems. But I would vote him in, yes.
Do you think he'll get in?
I don't think he'll ever get in.
What at this point, Barry? What is the avenue for him to get in? If
it would be the Veterans Committee, and he actually might have a better chance with the Veterans Committee than he would if it was up to a vote of the baseball writers. Because if you get the Veterans Committee is a much smaller group of voters, and so if you've got 12 out of 16 people who like you, then you can get in. So sometimes we've seen throughout the years the Veterans Committee, or whatever they call themselves, has a much different view on certain players than the Baseball Writers Association as a whole. And I also want to, talk about Pete Rose. One of his greatest moments was the 1975 World Series. He was the MVP of it. Baseball also lost another great in this past week, Luis Tiant, for the Red Sox, who was the best pitcher in that World Series. And a lot of people, I think, may have forgotten about him. I think he arguably has a case to be in the Hall of Fame, but everyone talks about the year of the pitcher in 1968 when Bob Gibson had a 1.12 ERA. Of course, that was just out of this world. It overshadowed Luis Tiant having a 1.60 ERA. But what was really cool about him is, these days, pitchers pretty well all have the same type of pitching mechanics, wind up, and everyone is sort of like a cookie cutter wind up formula. Luis Tiant had like one of the most unique. It wasn't that way back when he pitched, and he had one of the most unique pitching deliveries where he'd turn his back completely to the plate in his windup. I mean, it was so cool. I remember loving to imitate him in the backyard playing wiffle ball.
Always fun talking baseball with you, Barry. All right, we'll leave it there for this week. Appreciate you checking us out. Barry and I will be back next week, and we'll talk more high school football and maybe a little baseball. Who knows? Thanks, Barry.